Today, we're going to unpack a really thought-provoking article by Colin Jenkins. He draws this direct line, a connection, between American military culture and the way policing happens right here at home. His whole idea is that what a nation does way over there can have some really big and often invisible consequences right back here. So let's dive in and see how he builds his case.
Okay, so imagine you're 19 years old. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, and these words are just thundering out of some old box speakers. This quote from General George S. Patton, it's not just some historical artifact. For the author of the article we're looking at, this was the daily soundtrack of his life as he entered the military.
And this is exactly where his argument kicks off. We're in the summer of '94, and as a recruit in U.S. Army basic training, Colin Jenkins wasn't just learning how to march or shoot. He was being submerged in a really powerful mindset, one that he argues is absolutely key to understanding the link between a soldier and a police officer. So to really get his line of reasoning, here's how we're going to walk through it. First, we'll look at how a soldier is psychologically made. Then we'll zoom out to a broader cultural thing he calls objectification. We'll see how that gets internalized, and then, this is the key part, we'll connect all of that directly to the pipeline from veteran to police officer and the militarization of our own communities. All right, first up, the making of a soldier. Now, according to Jenkins, everything, and I mean everything that happens in basic training is done for a very specific reason. The main goal, as he sees it, isn't just about discipline. It's about fundamentally transforming who you are as a person. What's so fascinating here is how he breaks down that transformation. The article argues that to actually be effective in the pure chaos of a battlefield, a person has to be conditioned to react without a single moment of hesitation. And to do that, well, you have to suppress your emotions, your reason, even your compassion. You have to become a component of a much larger machine. The ultimate goal, Jenkins writes, is to create this kind of robotic, dehumanized state, because that is what helps you survive in a war.
But here's the thing. The author says this process doesn't just start in boot camp. Nope. He suggests the seeds for it are planted way earlier, right inside our broader culture, through this concept he calls objectification.
Objectification. This is a huge term for this analysis. It's basically the process of seeing and treating another person not as a complete human being, but as a thing, a tool or an object that's there for your own purposes. And this really shows you how deep the rabbit hole can go. He pulls from the philosopher Martha Nussbaum to show all the different ways we objectify people. Think about it. In a purely capitalist world, a CEO might see employees as just numbers on a spreadsheet. That's instrumentality. Or politicians might see working-class kids as just pawns for a war. That's viability. The author's point is that this way of seeing other people becomes almost a requirement for many of the systems we live inside. And this leads to something that Cambridge professor Simon Baron-Cohen calls empathy erosion. It's like when we're conditioned to see others as objects, our empathy can get switched off. We start relating to people as if they're just things. And according to the article, this makes us way more willing to engage in aggressive, unempathetic ways, which ironically are often seen as good traits in things like business or sports. So, okay, if our culture encourages us to see people as objects, and military training just refines that skill, what happens next? Well, the author points to this really interesting psychological process where people can actually start to adopt the mindset of the very system that holds them down. For this part, Jenkins brings in the work of the educator Paulo Freire. The basic idea is that people from an oppressed class, and in this case, he's talking about the working class, where most soldiers and police come from, don't always want to overthrow the system. Instead, they might start to identify with the oppressor. Their idea of making it becomes being the one who's in charge. And the article brings this right home to American society by using bell Hook's analysis of George Zimmerman. This quote suggests that all these different systems, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, they all kind of intersect and teach a person to see threats where there aren't any, to protect property no matter what, and to prove their manhood through aggression. It's a really powerful example of how these big abstract forces can get internalized by an individual. Which brings us to the most direct link in the author's entire argument, the pipeline that takes soldiers from foreign battlefields and puts them on domestic police beats. This is where those theoretical chickens, as they say, really start coming home. So the really crucial point here is the invisible baggage of war. A 2008 Rand Corporation study that's cited in the article found that about a third of soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan suffer from PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or major depression. And, a lot more probably don't report it because they're afraid of the stigma. And yet, law enforcement agencies actively recruit these same veterans. This quote from a sheriff's major really highlights what they see as the benefits. They can handle stress, they know how to take orders. But when you put this viewpoint right next to the data on the last slide, it's a pretty jarring contrast, and it raises some serious questions. And this is the central question the author is really asking. What happens when the hypervigilance, the triggers, all the unresolved mental health issues from a war zone are dropped into the high-stress day-to-day work of being a police officer? How does that change the way they interact with the public? You see, it's not just about the mindset of one officer. The article argues that the very tools and tactics of policing have changed, transforming communities into what some analysts have started calling a domestic war zone. Citing the journalist Radley Balco, the article traces this whole evolution over 40 years. It started with the first SWAT teams back in the late 60s, mostly as a response to riots. Then, the war on drugs in the 80s made SWAT raids a pretty common thing. And then, after 9/11, the war on terror just opened the floodgates for federal money, putting actual combat-grade military gear into the hands of local police departments. Now, this militarization is often justified by saying the job is incredibly dangerous, but the article presents these stats to kind of challenge that story. I mean, look, any death on the job is a tragedy, for sure, but the data suggests the actual risk of being maliciously killed as a police officer is way lower than a lot of other risks we face, like, for instance, your lifetime odds of being struck by lightning. And this is what that militarization actually looks like on the ground. These examples, they're pulled from an ACLU study, and they are pretty wild. You've got an armored personnel carrier in South Carolina, ironically named the Peacemaker. In North Dakota, a military drone was used in a dispute over some cows. And in Arkansas, there were actual plans for patrol officers to be walking the streets armed and dressed like soldiers on a battlefield. These aren't just a few weird cases, they're part of a trend happening all over the country. So, this brings us to the author's main point, the big idea, wrapped up in the title of his article. After tracing the psychology, the culture, the hardware, he argues that we are now living with the consequences of it all. That phrase, chickens coming home to roost, it actually comes from Malcolm X. He used it after JFK was assassinated. He saw it as blowback, the result of a culture of violence that had been directed at one group for so long that it finally turned on the powerful. Jenkins uses that exact same logic, arguing that the violence America has been projecting around the world is now being mirrored by an increasingly militarized and aggressive police force right here at home. And if you want to understand the sheer scale of this war culture, just look at the money. The United States accounts for 39% of all military spending on the entire planet. That is more than the next 11 countries combined. The author presents this as solid evidence of a national priority, a mindset that just filters down through American society from the very top. And so, we're left with the question that the article basically puts at our feet. If this analysis is right, that a culture of objectification and violence, perfected for foreign battlefields, has been brought back home into our domestic policing, what are the long-term consequences for our neighborhoods, for our trust in law enforcement, for the very fabric of American society? It is for sure a sobering thought to consider.